You're listening to a podcast by Adelaide West Uniting Church.
So what are we doing now?
Just introducing the episode.
Okay, so you're doing that and we don't have to do anything?
Oh, no, we're all going to...
Oh, we're all going to do that. Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
'cause-
Because this is the bit where we talk about what we've talked about.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what did we talk about? We talked about communion.
And we talked about
We
communion.
did talk about the Lord's Supper.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yes. Well, we talked about communion and the Lord's Supper, really. And
Yeah.
so distinctions were made.
They were.
Yeah. The passive tense was used.
We talked about what actually is valid communion. You know, what happened. Well, first of all, we started off with what happens in communion.
Yeah.
And then when it's valid, how often we meet.
Yeah.
Talked a little bit about what actually happens to you in communion.
Talked about what the elements mean, to us at least. The fact that you can't articulate exactly what they mean and why that's also kind of important.
Yeah.
We got to talk about what online services have taught us about the process of communion and that kind of thing, because that has opened up a lot more than what I think anyone would have anticipated pre-COVID. So, yeah.
Yeah, that communion be across time and space. Or time and place, perhaps more. We
Yeah.
talk about, don't we?
We didn't get into any decent arguments.
No, unfortunately.
We'll leave that for later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, communion is one of those things where you kind of just get to talk about how you come to communion and what you personally get out of it a bit more. Because it is such a personal thing. It was, we'll get the knives out in a different episode. It'll be good.
And yet we still talked about some of the things about corporate communion, the Holy Communion.
Yeah.
We did talk about that as well as incidental.
Yeah.
It's a good talk.
Yeah, it was a very good talk. I don't think any of us feel quite as tired after that one as what we did after the first one.
I rated it 3.5 stars out of 5. So
Right, okay. We're going to have a rating system.
It's episode 2. You don't want to peak too soon.
that's right. Exactly. We need room to grow.
Leave room for improvement.
Yeah.
And if you have any pointers on how to improve, please email Lynn at.
Oh, me. Always me.
Welcome to Open Ended. I'm James.
I'm Lynn.
And I'm Craig. This week we're exploring the question, what happens in communion?
We should probably start just with the most basic overview of what communion is. And Lynn, I was thinking you'd probably be a good person to go over that because you probably minister communion the most out of the three of us.
I guess I do. That's a big question to start with.
If someone had never come across communion, how would you explain it?
How would you explain it? I would explain it as something that we do to remember Jesus' death and resurrection, and so it's not just a memorial. It's a remembering. It's a remaking of the event of the Last Supper, so that in a sense, Christ is present as we come, as we gather together. There is a presence of Christ as we take the elements in communion. And so there's something that happens. It's like, I saw something once where someone was talking about how we show love to each other by touch. We sort of missed that a bit during COVID, really, didn't we? The handshakes went out and so forth. But we show depending on how well you know someone, it starts with a handshake and then it might go to a arm touch and so forth, if you know people or if you're comforting people, to a family member where it's obviously a hug, and then obviously to intimacy between two people. And so we show love by touch. And in a sense, I see communion as a way that God touches us, because there isn't a physical touch from God. And yet when we take the bread and the juice, it's sort of almost like God touching us in a sense. And so we have this, they talk about, and in fact it was Augustine that talked about, it's a visible sign of God's invisible grace. A visible sign of God's invisible grace. And we use those words in the liturgy that are a part of communion. So it's a remaking of the event with Christ. And there is a sense there that, Jesus isn't with us physically in the room And yet he is, as we have communion, we sort of sense that physicality, that communal act that we do together in communion. Have you got something to add to that?
I was going to say, this plays into some stuff I've heard you say before that I know was quite
Yeah. And I guess, like, if you asked me the same question, like, what is communion? I'd say that, leaning back on my Churches of Christ heritage a little bit, that they actually refuse to call it communion because communion is not a biblical word, and I say that in inverted commas because I don't feel quite as passionately about that as others do, but it would be referred to as the Lord's Supper, and that's because one of the important elements for communion is that it's actually a meal that we share together that Christ himself actually invites us into. So it's the Lord's meal in which we partake of. We're his guests. We sit around the table joined together by people from very different backgrounds and different beliefs. You have people with quite progressive Christian beliefs, conservative beliefs, anything in between, and what they have in common is this shared meal and the unity of God that it brings. But personally, just reflecting on communion, what you said about the physicality of God touching us, I love that image of that, because for me, communion is one of the few physical things that we actually do. Most of what we do in church is rational. We talk about it, we talk a lot. We pray, it's words. We preach from scriptures, it's words. And so communion is an embodied act that actually defies language in a sense. There's something that happens in it that is more than just the words around it, where God touches us, and how that touch happens is actually quite unique for each of us. We all experience it and understand communion differently. And what's beautiful about communion is that it doesn't matter if you come to it with a different understanding of how it transforms you or what it does for you, because that's the diversity of the meal that we're sharing with Jesus anyway. There's that beauty of us coming together and being one, hence the term common communion anyway. It's kind of like a common union. So communion kind of means coming together anyway. It's just that's kind of...
You should have started with Craig. He articulated that much better than I did.
Oh, absolutely not. No, there was definitely something in what you said that was very helpful to talk about.
It's hard to actually define communion in some ways, though, isn't it?
Yeah.
It depends on, who you're talking to and what the context is. But there is that picture of, we have the Leonardo da Vinci picture of the Last Supper, which is really quite interesting because it's become iconic on its own, and people actually think of communion a bit that way. Everybody's on the one side, so you can all see, all that sort of thing. So you have this picture around a table of this sort of this motley group of people that have been following him, all with different personalities and characters, and they didn't even know what he's doing. And sometimes in communion, I actually say that, when I go through the part of the what they call the narrative of the institution, which is when we talk about when Jesus was around a table on the night of his betrayal by, I often say by a mate to bring it into today, but by a friend, because he was a friend around the table. He took bread, he gave thanks, he broke it, and he passed it around. What were they thinking? Because we lose that now because we're actually doing it in remembering that act. But what were they thinking at the time? It's just so you look at that painting, and I've got a photo on my computer of some youth group guys from another church who actually recreated it. And so they're all doing there's one sort of leaning forward and all that sort of thing. And he sort of goes, oh, all right. Gets you into it today, and what would it look like today? I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting that you wonder what the disciples would have been thinking, because I don't think we have a definitive answer on what it all meant even now, even though we've been contemplating that for
several thousand years.
A couple thousand years, yeah. But for me, that's kind of part of the beauty of it, the fact that there is no one clear meaning of communion. Which I guess is sort of the wordlessness of it a bit coming through, is that because we haven't ascribed there is no one canonical meaning of communion. It means that it sort of invites this process of continuing to wrestle with it, of chewing over it.
Yeah,
Yes.
nice.
Because I like there's as someone who's I'm a published poet. I've I really love the fact that it is something that you can talk so many different ways about. Probably where I sit with it at the moment myself is the bread being Jesus's body, being his his embodied life. The fact that Jesus lived a life that I think on some level he would have known the entire time that it was going to lead to him getting in some trouble and being crucified, and he knew the sacrifice he was making, I think, as he was living. And because we're called to take up our cross and follow him, there's also that kind of sort of sacrificial element as well in a way, but to nourish ourselves off of the way that Jesus lived in his embodied life on earth is what should be feeding us, we should be taking into our body, and that should become our makeup. And then the wine is I think for me even more has take up your cross energy to me, because I think it's in Mark's Gospel when Jesus is praying in the garden and saying, God, if it's at all possible, take this cup from me. That's the cup that I think of when we say take this cup, is knowing where this is all going to go if we truly do take up our cross and follow Jesus. And so for me, that's a very weighty, solemn thing. And so it's like, for me, that is a real substantial way of recommitting to my faith whenever I take communion, because it's, this is the blood that was spilled. This is where this is leading. You'll make some good friends, but you'll make some powerful enemies, and that's going to get you in trouble. So, but at the same time, that's only one reading. That's that to me is probably the one that feels quite substantial. And I think similar to you with communion is the one thing that we have that's not words. For me, it's something that has a lot of weight to it, because a lot of our faith winds up becoming quite light, because prayer is a very light kind of thing. You are calling out to a loving God who will answer. There's a lot of joy in studying scripture and things, and again, that's also there's a certain lightness to that for me as well. Whereas communion, of all the things that we've got within our faith tradition, obviously living life in the world can be quite dark and heavy as well. But communion is the one thing, one of the things anyway, that I find that has a bit more weight to it. And I think it kind of comes with the fact that it is such an embodied and enfleshed thing.
And in that Mark reading where you talk about the take this cup from me, there's a not my will but yours in that, which is pretty weighty, isn't it? I like that.
As I was listening to you talk, there's a few things that came to mind for me, but the last thing that came to mind, and perhaps the most important thing, was it's almost like an apocalyptic view that you have. There's a darkness to it, and but also a revealing of a bigger reality that happens behind, and that's sort of prophetic. It speaks into your life, and it speaks into the future of your life, and these sorts of things. But the other thing that I picked up from what you were saying was following in Jesus' footsteps, and it just reminded me of the coronation, the recent coronation of King Charles, and the communion ceremony that took place there was both incredibly gilt, like it was gold, literally gold all around it, but at the same time it was incredibly simple and quite a powerful symbol of saying to the king, your life is a life of service to others. But actually, really, and this is what triggered me to what you were talking about, I really liked the way our service offered back to God as an act of receiving grace was actually part of the communion liturgy, and we don't do that. But I thought that was a really good place in a service to actually offer our service because of what you were saying about following in Jesus' footsteps and that sort of thing.
I often say when it's time to take the cup, you know, we remember the life that Jesus lived and the life that we're called to live. So it's at that moment, which is a little bit like you were talking about.
I think for me, it's almost the bread represents the life of Jesus, the wine represents the death of Jesus.
And we sort of partake in that in some way. But you're right, that there's that big link between that and, you know, the serving that we do. Because it's not our will, but God's will.
It's interesting when you say represents, because that brings us to the whole debate around, you know, the actual nature of the elements of communion, bread and wine, everyday objects, mundane almost, to the point of almost to the point of heresy, to suggest there's something divine about something so everyday as something that we toast in the morning to get us going, and something that we might drink in the evening to relax after a hard day's work. You know, one of the things that I react to is when the language around communion becomes symbolic, or like it's just a symbol of what we rationally believe, rather than being something meaningful that actually happens in a transformative way when we actually take the bread and the juice. So for me, I almost represents is better. I prefer represents to symbolic, because represents actually has more of a substantialness to it. Like there is something more to what we're doing than just it being, well, this cup makes me think about the sacrifice, this bread makes me think about the body, rather than being something that actually it represents it or it embodies it almost. And for me, the Spirit is such a vital and an important part of communion, because what the Holy Spirit does within us when we take communion is a special gift that only happens when we take this meal. So for me, that's what it means to say that the blood, the bread and the juice or the wine are actually Jesus' body and actually Jesus' blood. Not that they're physically, you know, not you physically drinking a cupful of iron water, and you know, and that you're actually chewing on flesh. But when you do take them in that moment of receiving the gift from God, you're actually also receiving the Holy Spirit in a particular and unique way. I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the language that we use around various practices and rituals is very important to consider. For me, to be able to say that it is... to say that the bread and the wine are Jesus' flesh and blood, I think is true in a certain sense, and it's not inaccurate to say that, and it's also not inaccurate to say that it's a representation.
Yeah.
Because I think for me, it's what does it mean to say that it is Jesus' flesh and blood? And I think, you and me would both agree that it's not literally the actual physical flesh and blood of Jesus, which is why I tend to go for the, Jesus' flesh is his life and his blood is the death that he knew was coming. And so is it a representation? Is it the thing? We're kind of in this spot where both are kind of simultaneously true in a way.
Yeah.
And I think probably the way that I think about communion is that it's a little bit like going out for coffee with someone, because you want the coffee to be good. But the coffee date is not about the coffee.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't be the same without the coffee either.
Yeah. That's a good analogy.
Yeah, and so in that respect, the wine is not Jesus' blood, but it is Jesus' blood, because you can't get that without the wine. So, there's a transcendental thing that happens on top of it through the act of participating.
Yeah.
And that's the important part, which to kind of skip ahead about. Because I know we were wanting to get into what makes communion valid or not. That to me is why I'm quite happy to play communion fast and loose, because I don't mind if the elements aren't quite right, because it's about facilitating the thing that happens in communion. It's you need a medium for communion to exist through. Exactly, and I think there's certainly something to be said for being very particular about the elements that you use, because that's an act of honoring it and keeping it sacred. Because the practice is what makes it sacred in a way, and so to do it with as much reverence and honor actually improves the ritual, I think, as opposed to just saying, "Oh, any old thing will do." But that being said, I am someone who has taken communion at an Easter camp with fairy bread and red cordial. Early on during the COVID lockdowns, Amy and I were watching church online, and we happened to have some chocolate and coffee on standby. And that's what we used.
It's beautiful communion.
Yeah,
There you go. Very sweet tasting.
Yeah. And, given that I grew up in a church that, was quite particular about the elements, but used grape juice instead of wine and used crackers instead of bread, if we're going to be really particular, I would say that, I would, I got a lot more out of communion the times that I have used, a loaf of bread and actual wine. And particularly when I've done it over a meal, which I've only done maybe a dozen times or so in my life, but that it's felt very different.
There's an opportunity for chocolate and coffee to become suddenly profound, and that actually
Ordinary
items, and that sort of brings us around to the question then of what actually makes communion. Like, how is, like, if I'm having dinner with my wife Naomi, why is that not communion versus when I'm sitting down to have bread in a cup in church? When is a meal not a meal? It kind of goes into that, the elements are the medium for the thing that happens, I guess, because I would say that you, to my mind, you would be able to have a meal and engage in communion through that. But you have to invoke something for it to become that almost, which kind of comes into your area of expertise again.
And I think different denominations different churches will have different things of what makes communion. And in my background, I've clearly had uniting. I started in uniting, then had 6 years in a Pentecostal church where, it wasn't as rigorous as what made up communion, and yet it was still very special. And even though I wasn't able to be a member because I wasn't baptised with enough water, I could actually conduct communion, which you could never do in the uniting church if you weren't either ordained or authorised. So, there are different views on all these things, and I think God just works around all of them. But in the uniting church, you definitely need to have a few things that are core to communion. So there's the great prayer of thanksgiving. You might not call it that, but there is a great prayer of thanksgiving which needs to include the narrative of the institution, which talks about what Jesus did. What are we remembering as we do this? So we recall what Jesus did at the Last Supper. So that needs to be in there in some form. The invocation of the Spirit needs to be in there as part of that. And then, obviously the breaking of the bread, which I love it when the breaking of the bread is messy, so when it's a bit hard in online church because we often have a piece of bread. I'd like to have an ordinary thing that you break, because that's what everybody that's watching has probably got as well. It's got a piece of bread from the from after toast that morning. That same loaf is used for that. So that's quite. But in person church, we use a cob, and I've asked them not to cut it too far. I don't like it so that I pick it up and it just falls apart.
You're pulling back the veil there and telling everyone our secrets and how we turn it over.
I want to
Yes, we cut it. We do cut it part way.
We cut it a little way, otherwise I just can't do it. But, I don't want it to fall apart. I want to wrestle with it.
It's the bread knife that pierced Christ's side.
It doesn't quite have the same ring.
It doesn't.
And then what we do at Adelaide West, where we have 3 in-person services, we actually use the same cob, so that the next time I actually grab it, and I mentioned that we're using the same. There's that sense of unity and communion. And so you take the next half then at the next service, and there's crumbs everywhere, and there's something good about that we're just sort of wrestling with this, because Christ's death was messy.
Yeah.
And
his life was messy too.
And his life was messy. So to have crumbs going everywhere is really appropriate. The other thing I like to do is I like to pour the juice. And I've only just started that on Church Online, but I've been doing it in person for a while. I've got this beautiful pottery jug, which it's done by Mark Pierce, a potter, and it says, poured out for you. And I like to pour it as a moment in communion. So we actually watch the juice.
Well, again, it's about that embodiedness, isn't it?
It is. Absolutely. Anything we can do to, in a sense, remember, because it is a moment of embodiment, communion. The whole thing is about embodiment. And so that's why I like that. So at the last Easter service, we actually didn't pre-cut the bread. And we had 3 of us actually slicing the bread while I was doing the liturgy. And people said it was quite powerful because I broke the bread first and then it went to the 3 of us and we all had knives. Unfortunately, one of them was a bit blunt, so Tricia had a bit more work than the rest of us. But there we were, cutting that up and then popping it out, and then people came forward. And it just added something. What was the question you asked me?
We're talking about what makes communion versus an ordinary meal.
Ordinary meal. So,
I mean, not to say that communion can't be an ordinary meal. It's just.
Well, I think there are, in the Uniting Church, we talk about 5 theological themes. So you've got the thanksgiving to the Father as the first person of the Trinity, the memorial or the remembering of Christ as the second person, the invocation of the Spirit as the third person of the Trinity, the sense of communal, like a communion is communal to the gathering, whether that's, and we might talk about this later, whether that's in person in front of you or whether that's online or whether that's together with all Christians across all time and all geography and so forth. So there's this sense of communion. And finally, there is the meal of the kingdom. There's a foretaste of what's to come. So they're the 5 theological themes that you would find within communion.
Something that you did touch on there, because I was wanting to ask this question specifically, which is who are we actually communing with, is I think very much worth a discussion. Because I think everyone can agree that if you're in the room with people and you're taking the elements with them, you are having communion with them. But if we are invoking the Spirit, are we communing with the Spirit? Are we communing with the church across time and space? There's a few different ways that you could read it. How do we give, and there is no absolute answer here either, but just for the 3 of us, how do we each conceptualize it in that respect?
I mean, I'd say yes.
Tick as many boxes as you like.
Yeah. All of the above.
I think there's kind of like a forward, backward, and upward kind of communing. We commune upward with God, the whole Trinity, not just one member. We commune backward with all the saints, going back to the apostles and Jesus himself. And we commune forward in the sense that we're communing with Christians all around the world right now. So those who are still with us in a physical presence. So there's a range of people that we're coming together with, and all 3 are beautiful and poignant. And you don't have to emphasize all 3 each time you take communion, because it happens anyway, whether you want it to or not. That's what you're doing.
And I think for me, with after COVID and the sense that there was this huge debate around the world as to whether we could do communion online or not. I had a
we did do communion online, so
we
tested it empirically. You can do it.
We believe that it's real communion.
And to me, what opened up was how communal communion was. It suddenly was no longer just in the church with the people I could physically see. For me, it opened up this communion across all people all around the world. And from there, I think I started to think about across time and space, because it didn't need to be synchronous. It could be asynchronous. So that means that, if I have it on a Sunday when, say, Church Online is happening and I'm doing it with other people at the same time, so that's synchronous. But then somebody watches it on Wednesday night and takes communion, but we're actually doing that with them as well. So for me, it opened up my perception of communion as less in the room and more across geography, across time. And I would add, I totally agree with you, but I would add, and with those that are yet to come as well. So there is this sense of looking back, right back to the time of those early apostles, of when Paul was writing about communion, and he called it the Lord's Supper. Yes, I know, but
we don't have to be pedantic. Let's not be pedantic.
He's writing about it, so right from those times right to the times that are still to come. And so you've got this beautiful picture. Now communion is so much bigger through COVID. Who knew? Well, it's so much bigger in my mind. It always was bigger, but it's so much bigger in my mind due to COVID.
It's that timelessness of God. God transcends time and space, and so communion can do the same because it's a gift from God.
Sorry, there's two different things I wanted to. I had something I was going to say a bit before, and then that just triggered something else. So I'll see if I can remember both of them. So for me, we're communing with everyone who eats the flesh and drinks the blood, in the ways that I was talking about before. So anyone who feeds themselves on the life of Jesus, and anyone else who has taken up that mantle, that is who we are communing with. And for me, that's where that sense of unity and belonging kind of comes from. It's that there is this one path, and we've all come to it from different places in life, different times, and that kind of a thing. But we're all, in a sense, on the same path, even though we all are walking different paths. Yeah. And now I've lost the other thing.
And that's different denominations, different churches, different ways of doing it.
Even just living different lives, because I'm not living either of your lives, I'm living mine, and that's true for everyone else. We all have our own context and our own relationship with God and our own paths. And so there is a heterogeneity no matter what. We have to, at least on that level, be pluralistic, and so then across denominations, and I would say that through the gospel there's enough of an argument to say that anyone who is doing the work that Jesus called us to do, even if they don't recognize it as the work of God necessarily, or they use a different God to access it or whatever, anyone who is doing that work in the world is part of that, at least by my theology. Obviously. Well,
I mean, it sort of comes to this point of communion is it's remembrance, it's sustenance, and it's unity. And you can't have unity without diversity. If everyone is all the same, that's not unity. That's oppression. Where unity, where it becomes unity, is where we accept each other as unique expressions of God's life within each and every person, expressing itself in beautiful and unique ways. And so communion is fantastic for that, because every Christian expression does it, but does it in ways that are meaningful to their expression of it, and within that individual expression as well.
And that's one of the reasons why I like children taking communion, even though I know that not all churches do that, but in the Uniting Church, children take communion, and you or I at in-person church take it out to the crèche, because there's that sense of they're learning about Jesus as they're doing this. There's that symbolism, there's that representation.
They're the gold standard according to Jesus.
That's right.
I've always found the argument against children taking communion amusing, because there's this the argument against children taking it is that they don't know what they're doing, so they can't take it seriously. They don't understand the sacrament of communion, and then suddenly you realise as an adult that I'm sorry, but communion is a mystery, and if you think you understand it, you haven't fully experienced it. If you believe that you completely understand it,
at least in a way you can articulate.
Yeah, exactly. You absolutely experience it, and the more you experience it, the less. It's almost like the less you can articulate it, the more you've experienced it, because it's so. It has to be what it is, because there's no other way of doing it, because there's no other way of expressing it other than taking it, really.
Yeah.
So it's part of our learning. And so
Yeah.
for a child, even a young child, they're learning about
Yeah,
Jesus
they can be transformed.
by this act.
Yeah.
And I was thinking a little bit earlier, we haven't talked about the mystery of it. I
Yeah.
must bring up,
The mystery.
where's the place to
Yeah,
bring up the
yeah, yeah,
mystery?
yeah,
And
yeah.
hello, we've just talked about, because it is a mystery.
Yeah.
Something, God does this, is God's love that is, we're embodying, and it's a beautiful mystery about it.
Yeah.
One, we can't necessarily understand it, but two, that's okay. There's a mystery, and we draw close to God in that mystery.
I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise that essentially what communion is a revealing of part of God's self to us. And God is inexplicable and beyond words. Like we certainly have words for understanding aspects of God. Like we look at a facet of a diamond. If you describe one facet of a diamond, that doesn't help someone to see the sparkle of it in light. There's only seeing a diamond sparkle that actually gives it a sparkle. You can't describe, even if you described every facet of it, you're not experiencing it. And it's the same with God and in communion. We're experiencing a facet of who God is that is in essence inexplicable.
Yeah, which I think is part of the reason why it being an embodied practice is such an important thing, because again, so much of everything else in Christianity is caught up in words. Whereas to use something else as an example, you can't describe something like grief. There's no rational thing about grief. If someone you love passes away, you're deeply upset, and it takes a long time to
And should be.
Yeah, exactly. But rationally, you're okay. Your life will go on. You will continue living, and you can rationalize your way out of it. And yet, it's there. It's the only way to truly understand grief is to have experienced it, or to have been at least close to someone else who's grieving. But then you're probably having grief about their grief as well, which is another thing. So you can't articulate grief. You can express it, and you can try and just say something to convey what you can of it. But ultimately, grief is also transcendent. And so in that way, that to me, that's how communion is transcendent. It's how God is transcendent. Because I think it's very easy to get caught up into the trap of, we can never know God. But I think there's an embodied knowing that you can't articulate. It's that you can understand it, but not in a way that can be fully encapsulated by words and transmitted to someone who hasn't also experienced it directly. And communion as an embodied practice that is wordless, I think, is a really powerful avenue for just accessing it in that, like in another way, in that more embodied sense.
You wonder what it would look like without communion. And we've talked about this on Church Online. If we weren't able to have communion, would we actually have a valid service? We were just flipping on its head here, because it's so important to our gathering together, whether that be virtual or in person. Where would we be without it?
And that raises the question of how frequently should you actually take.
Oh, this will be a
again, I have to disclose that I was ordained in the Churches of Christ, and part of the Churches of Christ's reason for existing, actually, like as a movement, it came into being because of its desire to take communion on a weekly basis. In fact, not even weekly, but whenever believers meet together and remember Jesus, that's actually the instruction, is whenever you do this in remembrance of me. So it can get a bit tedious where like, oh, well, we're doing an elders meeting tonight, should we take communion or not? Because we're meeting to remember what Jesus did. And there's more than two or three of us gathered here together.
So you sort of have to have communion.
Well, it's almost, but we don't. But
but why not?
But exactly.
If you're taking that,
exactly,
to that degree,
exactly.
why not?
Like, do we take? How literally do we take it? Obviously, there is an element of pragmatism that comes into that. Like, it's not always appropriate or easy to do it. But definitely for me. I think that whenever we come together to worship, particularly, what we're doing is gathering in remembrance of what Jesus done. We're gathering together as a united body, So I prefer every time we meet to worship, and I'd use that as the caveat. I mean, again, like worship can be broadly defined.
Yeah, our
Like,
whole life is worship, so
like
we
one of the
should have
things.
community.
Yeah. Well, that's actually not such a silly thing. I mean, you look at, say, for example, something like Green Team, where they might take communion every night on Green Team because you need that sustenance to go out and actually be among people who are difficult to be around.
And I think that's where different churches have different traditions. I don't have an issue with taking it or even conducting it each week. That would be a joy. I adore communion, whether I'm participating or conducting. It is an absolute joy. The Uniting Church has tended, but not all, but has tended to do it once a month.
Which I think is Presbyterian heritage.
Well, in some of the Presbyterian heritage, it was 4 times a year.
Yeah, it was very rare.
Really special,
Yeah.
So this was everybody turned up because it was communion week for that quarter. So it was something to be, there was a sense of anticipation and looking forward to and so forth. And I guess in the Uniting Church with once a month, that's probably a bit that too. So it's not something that we have to do because we happen to be meeting together, but it's, we do it at the first of the month at Adelaide West, both online and in person. And I love that weekend.
Yeah.
There's something beautiful about doing it at the same time for online as well as in person. Logistically, every week
that's
would
pragmatic.
be. That's right. You need all these volunteers and so forth. But and we have people in our midst that come from both Lutheran and Church of Christ background who would love to have it every week and are actually asking, could we have communion more often? What a beautiful thing to be asked.
Yeah.
That shows the desire and the anticipation. So I don't think that the churches in general take that unless, some denominations do. I know in the Pentecostal church we're a part of, it was every week. I don't think that means that we need to take it every week, but at the same time, I don't know what there's no nice, neat answer.
Well, there's no correct answer to how often. And the argument in favour of doing it every time is kind of it borders on biblical literalism. I wouldn't want to say it is biblical literalism, but it can tend towards that end of the spectrum, and it can also have the potential to make communion a little bit too mundane to the point that people actually start to tune it out because it's so frequent. And that's probably the argument in favour of doing it less frequently, is that we build up to it like Christmas. Christmas is exciting because it happens once a year. It wouldn't be Christmas if it was every day of the week. Communion is something special that we look forward to, and it's held as something special that we can enjoy because it's done monthly. I think that's the argument, that it tends to be
but it's not set in stone either. If you go to the Assembly website, the Uniting Church Assembly website, it'll say Uniting Churches tend to do it monthly. That's what it says.
And if you would like to see weekly communion on Church Online, please email Lynn at lynn@awac.org.au.
I mean, or we just make a playlist with all the communion services in it, and people can just replay them as often as they need.
That's an interesting concept.
Although we have actually, although Lynn, you and I have talked about what the ins and outs of actually ministering communion online are, because while you and me are very, we're down the more permissible end of, communion is legitimate if done online, we have both agreed that there are certain things that would not quite be right online as well.
And one of them is that I was asked recently whether, because there was a congregation that was considering using our service and using communion, and we do have a couple that do that, and they were just checking with the presbytery whether that was okay, and presbytery came and asked whether we do it afresh each time, or do we use it one we've recorded before. Absolutely not. And it is absolutely fresh every time, and in fact we don't even do a
never done
retake.
We've never done a second take of communion. I think we may have had to restart before we actually got to the elements, but once we hit the elements, it's one take.
It.
Yeah.
And we've never articulated that until I said, oh, actually, we don't even do a retake. It just doesn't seem right.
Yeah,
it's authentic.
yeah.
So, you know, like we had a couple of months ago where I decided to have a scone instead of bread, and I took the scone, it was a bit crumbly, and as I took it, I took too much, and then my voice completely went.
You choked a little bit as well.
I choked.
I was a bit worried.
and I grabbed the juice, and I sort of had a few more than just one, you know, quite a few sips. To try and be
if you go back and watch that communion, it is really, we take the cup.
How did the minister die? Well, let me show you.
I was going to say, getting closer to Jesus than you intended to.
And we did not do a retake.
No, we didn't.
Because it's authentic at that moment. In fact, we take communion, like I clearly do this with James in the room. You're there. And so I actually have... we finish the bread together, and you've got a juice that I bring out to you as well, and we have that afterwards because we feel like, you know, this is real, and we know it's real, and so we actually share that together. And then we had that strange one at the end of last year. It was about 4 days before New Year's Day. Communion was on. The New Year's Day was on a Sunday.
Oh, yeah.
And so we did about 3 days
that's right.
before.
Yeah.
So we took communion. We had this strange moment where we realised we were having together the first communion of the year, but it was still the old
the
year.
31st of December.
And it just felt like we were doing this time travel across into another year. That's how real it is.
Yeah. And the fact that when you minister communion online and then you and me have it afterwards, it's definitely the same communion, and yet it's been ministered at one time. You and me I've had it at another, and then everyone else has it at different times as well.
That's correct.
And so it really bridges that interesting gap of, you know, can communion be done across time and space? And without something like Church Online, it becomes a very theoretical discussion. But this really provides a link between an embodied practice and you know, what you could theologically argue for about, you know, we are communing with the rest of the church across time and space, because it's embodied, but it is also across time and space somehow, which has been really fascinating to find ourselves in the middle of.
It has, and I think there was an incredible amount of discussion, there still is around the world, about whether to be able to continue that practice or even do that practice. And as people are in lockdown longer and longer, I think some denominations around the world sort of finally went, well, okay, just for this moment type of thing. I would argue that communion is actually virtual by its very nature. In fact, you know, Christ is not physically present amongst us that we can see, and so we do this in a sense as a virtual practice to embody everything that Jesus was and is. And so I actually did a bit of my last hermeneutics subject major assignment I actually did on this, because it was quite pertinent as to how we approach communion in this in a virtual setting, and some would say still that, you know, it needs to be synchronous. We all need to be taken at the same time for that sense of community. But I would say I think the mystery is far greater than that.
I mean, if we were going to do it synchronously, then we all should be back in time at Christ's actual giving of the First Supper. Otherwise,
that assumes that we are communing with Christ when we commune, and not just communing with the people in the room.
Exactly. So we already do it asynchronously.
There you go.
And so, you know, theologically, there's I think what happened in COVID was we went online to give communion because of an emergency, but we accidentally actually started caring for people that we probably should have been caring for all along.
Yes.
Because
That's right.
the people aren't just shut in because of COVID. People are shut in for any number of reasons and aren't able to get to church. I mean, my parents enjoy church online because that's their church community. They live remote, and that's the church they can get to on a Sunday morning.
And they see their son sometimes too.
Yeah, well, that is apparently that's an alleged advantage. But yeah, there's a sense in which people separated by distance and time. That's actually more of a reason to do it, not less of a reason if they're separated by distance and time. We want to look after everybody, not just people who can get here.
And that was one of the things that Paul wrote to the Colossians, and it's really interesting because he was writing as a loving pastor to the church in Colossae, and he'd never been there. But nevertheless, he was this virtual pastor to them, talking about how they're taking communion. And part of that was that they weren't being inclusive. People were coming and they were just eating their own food and so forth, and not leaving anything for the workers and so forth that would come later, who didn't have much money and didn't have much food. And he's going, no, this is not what communion is meant to be. So we see there this incredible sense of inclusivity where and you think of people that live remote, people that are isolated, people that are not able to come to church due to illness or health or a variety of reasons. And suddenly they're able to take communion, to participate in communion with the rest of the church. And we didn't think about that before. Well, we probably did to a little bit because, you
take communion to
you take communion, and back in the day you would have communion and then you would have the elders all take, authorised, all taking, to everybody. Well, that wasn't at the same time, was it?
No.
So we were still doing it at a different time. So we probably thought about it a little bit, but not to the extent of today. And now there's this beautiful inclusivity. So we have a church on the Eyre Peninsula, about 12 people that meet. They actually use the online service. And when I say to share the bread with anyone else that's in the room, they actually stop the video and they share out the elements, just distribute the elements, and then they start again. And I just think that's beautiful. There's a community that would either need to get someone authorised. They don't have a pastor. They need to get someone authorised. And here's someone who happens to be authorised who's able to lead them in that.
Should we talk a bit about the authorisation issue as well? Because I don't think there were a lot of uniting ministers around in the early church. No. Don't remember them showing up in the New Testament too much.
No.
And I could definitely tip my Church of Christ hat here and
Yeah,
say
you're going to have something.
this would be a very different answer to what the Uniting Church would say, and so I could get myself in trouble here because I am looking to be admitted as a Uniting Church minister. But the important thing
Think about what you say right now.
That's right. Don't watch this if you're for admissions. Because I'm going to disagree with the Uniting Church in saying that the supper belongs to, well, whose supper is the Lord's Supper? It's in the name, the Lord's Supper. It's the Lord's Supper that we are inviting people to join into, and not our supper. And so, in a sense, all we're doing is being someone who invites people into it and facilitates it. So I'd say that you don't need to be ordained to lead communion or to take people through communion. That said, we would still be expecting that you treat it with solemnity and that you include things like the institution of the Lord's Supper, the invocation of the Spirit, things like Thanksgiving, all those kind of elements that you see in it. You still want to do all that stuff. It needs to still be treated as special, and so it's not something for people to
treat lightly, I guess.
Yeah, treat lightly. And so, we wouldn't authorise people to do it, but then we wouldn't necessarily ask some people to do it either. If
correct.
But I understand that Wesley particularly had a problem with this because in his movement there were people who were preaching things that were pretty ordinary and he wasn't comfortable with, and they were leading communion. And so in order to make sure that the reputation of the Wesleyan Methodist movement was actually upheld as godly, those people were not authorised to preach or take communion because they were actually not on message. And so there is a place for saying, we authorise someone or we don't authorise someone to take a uniting church communion as an official body,
Yes.
because there is a reputation to uphold. Trust is probably the word. You can trust that when you take communion in the uniting church, that the person who is leading it has been theologically reflective about this, has participated in it many times. And that sort of thing. So I mean, like, if lay people within our church were taking communion at their home group, that would be fine. But it would be understood that this is not the church giving communion. This is us taking communion as our group, or what have you.
Yeah, that actually taps in a little bit to something I wanted to come back around to a bit before, because I mentioned at one point that like some of the most impactful communions I've had real bread, real wine. These were at essentially home church meetings that my family was going to, I think, once a month for a couple of years or something, when I was sort of 10 or 11, maybe early high school even, around there. And because that was a home church, it, like, authorization didn't really enter into it. There was one person who would have been there every time who has since become an Anglican priest, but I don't think he was ordained at the time necessarily. And even if he was, that wasn't how was happening either. And so there's kind of almost two different ways that you can go about communion in a way. There is the you can either lean on the sacredness of it or lean on the mundanity of it a little bit more. And both of those things are always present, obviously, because it's always bread and wine, which you've been able to get like across the world for a long, long time now, which is part of the beauty of it. There's, and almost going back a bit to how frequently you should take it as well, there's that thing of the less often you take it, the more special it becomes. If you do it inside a church building with a church community where someone who's ordained, who knows how to treat it with reverence, is ministering it, then it becomes this very elevated, holy experience. And I mentioned before about the act of keeping stuff sacred makes it sacred. And so there's a lot of that going on. There's a lot of, we're making sure that, due diligence has been done and all that stuff. And so the rarity of it kind of makes it more special in a way. However, the number of times I've been sitting down for a glass of wine or something, and like my wife and I have been having some cheese and crackers or whatever. And there's been times where, like, I've just absentmindedly picked up a cracker, had a glass of red wine in the other hand, and just had a moment where I've
Remembered.
Not even mentioned anything, because I don't want to interrupt my wife when she's talking about interesting things. But I've still had that moment of kind of just coming back and essentially having, like, communing with all those who are on the same path with me there, just because I've recognized what's happened, just purely circumstantially. And so there's a certain, and I think also talking about the coffee and chocolate during COVID as well, there is a certain sort of exhilarating sacredness to opportunistic communions, I find, because that to me has a bit more of the flavor of how I imagine the early church as well. The reason, the fact that, two everyday items, bread and wine, are what make it up. The odds of you happening across them and accidentally having a piece of bread on a side plate and a glass of wine as you're taking a meal is far from zero.
That's right.
It actually speaks to how communion, how eating was in the early church. So in Jesus' time and in the ancient Roman world, there was a sense that you only really eat with family. So when you eat with someone, what you're saying is, I equate this person to myself as my family, and we actually have the same status. So when Jesus started saying to people to take meals with the poor and the destitute, he's actually saying to them, identify yourselves with the people who are failures, not the people who are great. But what you end up getting in the early church is slaves who have been set free and landowners eating meals together. Partly the landowners and the wealthy are actually paying for the meals for the poor. So there's an element of actually providing for the poor in communion that we don't really think about these days. But there's almost a sense in which, like, it's whenever you eat, you're going to be every time you sit down to a meal, be reminded of what I've done for you. So that the everyday act of having breakfast or having wine and crackers actually could be a prompt to remember Jesus and everything he's done for you. And in that sense, it is actually communion as well, because that's, one of the core parts.
Is there a difference, perhaps, what we're talking about when we're talking about authorization is that for public communion, there is some form of authorization. Definitely. So even as you were saying before about, in the Church of Christ, like people don't need to be ordained necessarily, but they're still asked by the church.
Yeah, definitely.
So in a sense, I would say that's a form of authorization.
Yeah, absolutely.
So each denomination will have their own form of authorization. So in the Uniting Church, you need to either be ordained or authorized, and part of that authorization includes some training to take this to seriously, and you actually need to, when you're not ordained, you actually need to follow a very set liturgy, which is about respect for communion and making sure that the various parts of communion are actually lived in there.
And honestly, having experienced Churches of Christ as well, like there is something nice about being able to train your people to lead communion, so that it doesn't take four quarters of an hour. Sorry, not 4 quarters, 3 quarters of an hour. 4 quarters of an hour. It doesn't take an hour and a half or something like that. It is nice that it's actually done with respect to the people who are taking it, as well as
and
the meal itself.
In the Uniting Church, once you're ordained, you are able to, with the training and the formation and so forth that you've done, you're able to change around some of the liturgy and so forth in there. But the liturgy is always underneath. It's always there. So there'll always be the invocation of the Spirit. And I've been in very formal settings for communion and very informal settings where I've gone through, there's the invocation of the Spirit. Oh, look, it's not called over here in that informal setting. It's not called all those things, but it is there. And so if you think of from that aspect, you can see where it came from with Wesley and so forth. And I didn't know that story, so now I do.
It might not be true, just to warn you. I'm remembering something that I think I've read.
You were giving it as a story, and usually we remember narratives pretty well. I think. Some of the details
I'm going, didn't know that. And I understand that. So, and then I also understand, churches don't always get this stuff right, but we end up with traditions that are our tradition, and that's our tradition in the Uniting Church.
I think there's something nice.
That's certainly what we live with here.
I think there's something nice, even though communion, the Lord's Supper, as it happened, didn't happen liturgically. I think there's something nice about having liturgical elements to it, in that it becomes familiar, and there's a comfort and a safety in familiarity that, like during COVID, for example, in a Churches of Christ church, we wrote a communion liturgy that we used for our online every week, the same, so that when people came to it online, they knew exactly how it was going to go. And they knew exactly when to have their bread and juice ready and all those sorts of things. And we hoped that would actually be a comforting thing, because, this part we can just relax because we know how it goes and what's going to be in it.
And lean into it. So to speak.
Exactly.
And we had a lot of similar considerations with Church Online as well, of wanting to have a fairly consistent format for the same kind of reason. And every time we do communion, it's basically the same format. So
it is. I move there might be a few different wordings and so forth in there, but it's very much it's a simplified format because we are in lounge rooms or wherever we are, but nevertheless all the elements are in there, like the invocation of the Spirit and the remembering, and all of those things are there, the breaking of the bread.
And I think while communion as we do it in a liturgical context is not exactly the same as what it would have happened, very early on.
No.
It's, for me, there's still something in that, even, as things have, kind of grown over the centuries and everything, is that taking communion in that context then really does ground us in those centuries of tradition, all those people who have been on the same path. And so for me, it's another point of access of all the other people who are following Christ. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, I think you can also go back and do like a real opportunistic, basic early thing, which still can invoke the same thing. And again, it's similar to what I was saying about, sort of that more heightened, rarer communion versus the more mundane one. Both things have a lot of value, and so you can come to it and get a lot out of it either way, which I think is really, like, to me, that's a huge testament to sort of just how powerful communion is that it can look vastly different in a lot of different contexts and still be communion and do such a wide array of things that are so transcendental.
And what you say actually raises an important caveat that we don't actually do things just because the early church did them.
We're not selling all our possessions.
Well, that's the thing. If we sold all our, like the Jerusalem church, where everyone sold all their possessions and held everything in common, all ended up with Paul begging for money from churches all across the whole of Christendom. We don't necessarily want to be like the Corinthian church, which had to be written to a number of times to correct them. There is a sense in which the early church is glorified because of its rapid success, but that there were huge problems with the early church as well. So to say, oh, we just take communion like this because that's literally how Jesus did it, well, maybe that's actually not taking into account the wisdom and the deep conviction and experience of centuries of Christians tuning these things to our betterment, I suppose. Betterment's not really a word, is it?
It is now.
Well, betterment is a word, but it's but at the same time, of course, just because something is in line with the centuries of tradition doesn't mean that that's the only way of doing it. Which is again why I think the fact that both going for trying to go closer to the original experience and also being more in line with tradition, that both have a lot to offer.
Yeah, definitely.
And I'm really glad that I've been able to experience both and a lot in between over the course of my life, because coming to communion in so many different ways over the years has taught me so much. Because having those moments of deep reverence, it's so out of the ordinary from the rest of our life, but at the same time, when you grow up in the church, it does become the norm as well. Yeah. And so then having something that's a lot more mundane and embodied and is just a bunch of people having a meal together, and then the wine and the bread comes out and someone says a prayer, and that's sort of the whole thing. That again has been somehow even rarer. So,
and I think there's a remembering in that, and the remembering is a big part. So you've got two things there. You've got the communal and you've got the remembering. And I like that thought, cracker in one hand, a glass of juice or wine in the other, and just in that moment, remembering. There's something very simple and yet very profound in that.
I think it's probably also important to mention that when those moments do happen, the moment catches me. It's not It's not something that I try to engage with every single day, because I think if it did, then it would become a pure labor as opposed to a moment. Because like what I was saying before, communion is a thing that kind of happens under the surface of what we can articulate, and so if that starts to happen, I make sure I'm attuned to it and receptive when it does. But at the same time, I don't necessarily push to seek it out all the time either, which I guess comes back to how frequently should we do it, because it's about facilitating something ultimately. And so it just depends on how it's like, who are the people who are participating in this communion regularly, and how can you best facilitate their engagement with it on that sort of more transcendental level. And so for some people, doing it more often will actually be the thing that is more spiritually fulfilling. And for some people, saving it and savoring it is probably the way to get there. So
saving and savoring. That's helpful.
Yeah, very poetic.
But I would see what you were doing when, with the crackers and juice or wine, that is a moment of communing with God. It is not the Holy Communion with a capital T, but it is the Holy Communion without capitals, so to speak, because you are communing with God in that moment. It's an aha moment to remember God. Oh, this reminds me of, I love that, because we're always looking for where we see God at work at the world, and where we, those reminders along the way, that's what, this is what Jesus did, and so forth. I think that's really, but there's that difference between that and then, in my mind, that and then the Holy Communion in capitals, which is, and yet some of the things are the same. There's the presence of Christ, so if you think of the Holy Communion being the presence of Christ and the invitation to experience God's grace, and that to me is one of those two things are the joys of bringing communion, as the presence of Christ and the invitation to experience God's grace. There's nothing that beats it, really. It's pretty special.
I think that's probably the end of the episode.
Yeah, I
Think
felt like,
so? Do you think I just did I just do a wrap up without doing
No, that felt like it was coming into.
It did feel that like, no, that's good.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. Open Ended is directed and produced by JC Finlay for Adelaide West Uniting Church, with music by Tadro Abbott.
If you would like to participate in our online church services, they are available on the Adelaide West Uniting Church YouTube channel from 10 a.m. every Sunday, Adelaide time.
If you'd like to get in touch with us, send an email to churchonline@awuc.au, and you can visit our website at awuc.au.